The Boston County Courthouse gleamed under the morning sun, an unfamiliar battlefield compared to the ones where I, Captain Sienna Burke, had served. I pushed open the heavy oak doors, each step on the marble floor measured, disciplined, controlled. A discipline honed by years in the military. It was a stark contrast to the storm churning inside me. I spotted them immediately, Linda and Mark, my parents. Linda's perfectly manicured hand rested on her lawyer's sleeve as they whispered, a shared smirk playing on their lips. Her voice, dripping with theatrical pity, carried across the hall, deliberately loud enough for me to hear. Look who finally decided to show up. Our little soldier girl has blessed us with her presence. I ignored the provocation, my back straight, my chin high, and walked directly to the defendant's table. I wasn't a little soldier girl, but I would let them discover that mistake on their own. The moment Judge Reynolds entered and his voice boomed, "Captain Sienna Burke," a hush fell over the room. It is an honor to have an officer decorated with the Bronze Star Medal in my courtroom. Linda's face went pale. The balance of power they were so sure was in their favor had just been shattered. My training kicked in the moment I stepped inside. The high-ceilinged room, smelling of old wood polish and animosity, was a new kind of combat zone. My mind, conditioned to assess threats, did a swift reconnaissance. The judge's bench was the high ground. The opposing counsel's table, the enemy position. And seated there, looking entirely too comfortable, were the primary hostiles, my mother and father. I could hear Linda's low murmur to her lawyer, a man named Miles Archer, whose expensive suit couldn't hide his predatory smile. "Get this over with quickly, Miles," she whispered, though her voice had a caring quality she used for public effect. "The girl has nothing. She's just a grunt, used to following orders." The words were shrapnel, tearing into something deep inside me. A grunt. After everything I had done, everything I had become, that's all I was to her. The sting was sharp, visceral. But my face remained a mask, an impassive shield forged in the dust and tension of Afghanistan. You don't give the enemy the satisfaction of seeing your wounds. You just don't. I took my seat at the defendant's table, the wood cool and solid beneath my hands. My own lawyer, Evan Mitchell, gave me a brief, reassuring nod. He was an ex-Ranger. He understood the language of a fight. Linda then turned her attention directly to me. Her voice, now laced with a cloying, false sweetness, cut through the quiet hum of the courtroom. "Oh, look at her in a suit," she said to my father, loud enough for the clerk and the bailiff to hear. "Trying to look professional. Isn't that cute?" My father, Mark, didn't even grant me a full sentence. He shot me a single dismissive glance before turning his wrist over to check the gleaming face of his Rolex. It was a gesture I knew well. It meant his time was valuable, and I was wasting it. The unspoken contempt was more painful than any insult. To them, I wasn't a person, not really. I was an obstacle, a nuisance in the narrative they had constructed for themselves, an inconvenient loose end in their otherwise perfect life. I kept my gaze fixed on the judge's empty chair, focusing on my breathing. Inhale for 4, hold for 4, exhale for 4. Box breathing. The technique had kept me steady through mortar attacks and IED sweeps. It would keep me steady now. This was just another mission. The objective: survive. The rules of engagement, different, but the principle was the same. Maintain discipline. Do not engage emotionally. Wait for your moment. Then the bailiff's voice rang out. "All rise." The heavy doors behind the bench opened, and Judge Reynolds entered. He was a tall man in his late 60s, with a posture that spoke of a military past. His black robes couldn't conceal the ramrod straightness of his spine. A Marine Corps veteran, Evan had told me. He moved with an economy of motion that I recognized instantly. He was a man who understood command. His eyes, sharp and intelligent, swept the room, taking in every face. They passed over Linda and Mark, lingered on Miles Archer for a second, and then they found me. There was a flicker of recognition, of shared understanding. He looked down at the documents on his bench. "We are here today in the matter of the Carter estate," he began, his voice filling the room with an authority that demanded absolute silence. He adjusted his glasses. Before we proceed, I want to acknowledge the presence of the defendant. He looked directly at me. My name was on his lips before he even spoke it, and the air in the room shifted. Captain Sienna Burke, he said, his tone formal and resonant. A current went through the courtroom. Captain, not the girl, not the grunt. My father's jaw tightened, a small muscle twitching in his cheek. Linda's perfectly painted lips parted slightly, the smug confidence evaporating from her face, replaced by a flicker of confusion. Judge Reynolds wasn't finished. He looked from me to my parents and then back to me. I see from your file, Captain, that you are a recipient of the Bronze Star Medal for your service in Operation Enduring Freedom. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, a fact, dropped into the middle of the room like a grenade. The silence that followed was absolute. The shrapnel from my mother's earlier comment was now useless, neutralized. The entire premise of their attack, that I was a nobody, a failure, a little soldier girl, had just been dismantled by the highest authority in the room. I saw the change in Miles Archer's eyes. The easy confidence was gone. He was reassessing. He wasn't facing a broken daughter his clients could bully into submission. He was facing a decorated field-grade officer of the United States Army. He was facing an opponent who had been trained to think strategically, to endure hardship, and to fight with unrelenting resolve. I met his gaze across the room. I gave him nothing. No smile of triumph, no hint of the vindication that was roaring through my veins. I just held his stare, calm and steady. This was the first time they had ever been forced to confront a version of me they couldn't diminish or ignore. The shock on their faces was a small, bitter victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. The initial skirmish was over. The battle lines were now clearly drawn. And as I sat there in the cold, sterile silence of the Boston County Courthouse, I knew this fight was no longer just about a will or an inheritance. This was about honor. And the battle had just begun. The sharp rap of the judge's gavel faded, but the echo of his words, Captain Sienna Burke, remained, hanging in the cold, hostile air of the courtroom. The shock on my parents' faces was a cold comfort. As the court took a brief recess, the frigid reality of the room, with its dark mahogany and unyielding marble, began to seep into my bones. And my mind, seeking warmth, seeking a truth that made sense of this moment, drifted north. It left the harshness of Boston and traveled back in time, landing in the one place I ever truly felt safe. My grandmother Margaret's warm, cinnamon-scented kitchen in Portland, Maine. It all started there, really. In 1993, I was 6 years old. I remember the feeling of being passed from one set of arms to another. My mother, Linda, didn't hug me goodbye. She just transferred me. Her hands were firm on my shoulders for a moment, and then I was enveloped in the soft, lavender and vanilla scent of my grandmother. Linda never even met my eyes. Her focus was on her reflection in the car's rearview mirror, carefully checking her lipstick. "It's just for a few months, sweetie," she'd said, the words as thin and fragile as a soap bubble. "Mommy and Daddy have a huge opportunity, and we just need some time to get settled." "A few months," my father, Mark, repeated from the driver's seat, his voice laced with an impatience he didn't bother to hide. He tossed my last duffel bag into the trunk of their sedan with a thud that felt so final. He was a man in a hurry, and I was the last piece of luggage to be offloaded. Standing on the porch of their cozy clapboard house was my grandfather, Charles. A retired judge, he said nothing. But his silence was a verdict in itself. His arms were crossed over his chest, his gaze fixed on my parents, and in his eyes I saw a profound sadness mixed with a disappointment so sharp it could cut glass. He knew their promise was hollow. He knew this wasn't a temporary stop. It was a destination. The car pulled away from the curb, leaving me on the porch, a 6-year-old girl clutching her grandmother's hand, watching a forgotten promise disappear down the street. That broken promise became the defining theme of my childhood, a theme best illustrated by a collection of empty chairs. The first ones I remember were at my 4th grade piano recital. I was playing a simple piece by Bach, my heart pounding in my chest. I'd practiced for weeks. Before I started, I scanned the front row, where 2 seats were reserved with little paper signs, Mr. and Mrs. Carter. They were starkly, painfully empty. My grandparents were there, of course, beaming in the 3rd row, but my eyes kept being drawn back to that void. Years later, at my high school graduation, I stood at the podium as valedictorian. I spoke of futures and possibilities, my voice steady, but my gaze swept over the crowd, searching for them out of a stupid, stubborn habit. They weren't there. When I walked off the stage, my grandparents crushed me in a hug, their faces wet with tears of pride. Their presence was my anchor, but the absence of my parents was a ghost that haunted every achievement. The most cutting absence, the one that finally severed the last thread of hope, was at my graduation from West Point. There is nothing in the world like that day. The sea of gray dress uniforms, the roar of the crowd, the weight of 200 years of history settling on your shoulders as you toss your cap into the air. It's a sacred moment, not just for the cadet, but for the family who supported them. All around me, families were weeping, embracing, their pride a tangible force in the air. And in the middle of it all, 2 seats with their names printed on them sat empty. Linda called that evening, not to congratulate me, not to say she was proud. She called to complain. "Sienna, you have no idea the traffic we hit," she'd sighed into the phone. "We were supposed to go to this charity auction in the Hamptons for a very important cause, and we just couldn't make it to both. It was an impossible choice." An impossible choice. The United States Military Academy versus a cocktail party. I finally understood where I stood. Even on the rare occasions they did appear, it was somehow worse. I was 15, and they'd made a surprise visit for Thanksgiving. I was thrilled, naively believing this time might be different. I'd just won the state debate championship and couldn't wait to tell them. As Grandma Margaret carved the golden brown turkey, the air filled with the scent of sage and roasting potatoes, I excitedly told them about my final argument. Mark just gave a distracted nod, his eyes already drifting towards my grandfather. "So, Charles," he said, cutting me off, "what do you think of the tech market right now?" Linda picked at her food. "Margaret, this turkey is a little on the dry side, don't you think?" I fell silent, the triumph of my victory turning to ash in my mouth. I was an extra in my own life, a minor character who was occasionally allowed a line or two before the real stars took over. That Thanksgiving, a holiday meant to celebrate togetherness, was the loneliest day of my life. But the final, irrevocable break came at my grandmother Margaret's funeral. The grief was a physical weight, crushing the air from my lungs. She had been my mother in every way that mattered. My parents arrived late, Linda complaining about the drive from Boston. As I stood beside my grandmother's casket, my hand resting on the polished wood, I whispered a promise to her, tears streaming down my face. A promise to be strong, to be good, to make her proud. And in that sacred private moment of grief, I heard Linda's sharp whisper from behind me, directed at Mark. "I wonder how much she left." The world fractured. The quiet, sterile air of the funeral home, the scent of lilies, the faces of mourning friends, it all dissolved into a meaningless blur. In that single whispered question, everything became clear. For them, love was a transaction. Grief was an inconvenience, and death was just a financial opportunity. The unconditional love my grandparents had given me and the calculating emptiness of my parents were 2 separate, irreconcilable worlds. My grandfather's words from long ago came back to me then. "Love is a choice we make every day, Sienna, not a feeling that comes and goes." My grandparents chose me every single day. My parents chose themselves. If you've ever had that one person in your life who was your rock, your true north when everything else was chaos, the one who chose you, no matter what, I'd be so grateful if you'd hit that like button to honor them, and in the comments, just write the name of your Grandma Margaret or Grandpa Charles. It helps to know I'm not alone in this. That day, at my grandmother's coffin, I made another promise, this one silent. I promised I would live a life defined by my grandparents' choices, not by my parents' absence. I just never imagined that choice would lead me here, to a cold courtroom, fighting for the very legacy of the love they gave me. After the first day in court, I didn't go back to my sterile hotel room in Boston. I couldn't. Instead, I drove the 2 hours north to Portland, to the only real home I'd ever known. Pulling into the driveway of my grandparents' house felt like taking my first full breath in days. The quiet neighborhood, the familiar scent of salt from the nearby coast, the sturdy presence of the old house, it was all an anchor in the storm of the lawsuit. But it was my grandfather's study that called to me. It had always been my sanctuary, a place of quiet wisdom and absolute truth. The room was exactly as he'd left it. The scent of old books, worn leather, and cedar filled the air, a fragrance I associated with safety. His worn leather armchair still faced the large window overlooking the garden. His law books, hundreds of them, stood like silent soldiers on the shelves, a testament to a life lived in service of order and justice. I ran my hand along the spines of the books, seeking some of his strength. And that's when my eye caught it. My training had sharpened my observation skills, teaching me to notice what's out of place, the subtle deviation from the pattern. Behind a thick volume of Massachusetts general laws, the wood paneling of the bookshelf seemed just slightly misaligned. Curiosity piqued, I pulled the heavy book away. Behind it was a small hidden compartment, and inside that compartment was a handsome wooden box. My heart began to beat a little faster. With reverent hands, I lifted it out and placed it on his large mahogany desk. It wasn't locked. Inside were not journals, but ledgers. A dozen of them, bound in dark green leather, each meticulously labeled with a year. 2003, 2004, 2005. All the way up to the last year of his life. They looked like something a character from a Dickens novel would use. My grandfather was from a generation that believed in keeping records, in the tangible, undeniable truth of pen on paper. I picked up the most recent one, its cover cool beneath my fingertips, and opened it to a random page. His familiar, elegant script filled the lines, and the words I read hit me with the force of a physical blow. January 14th, 2025. Linda called. Needs money for one of Mark's investment opportunities. Sent $2,500. Entry, number 264. Entry, number 264. My mind went numb, shifting into the cold, analytical mode I used on missions. I did the math, my fingers tracing the numbers in the air. 264 payments. That was 22 years. 22 years of monthly payments. A quick calculation on my phone confirmed the horrifying total. $660,000. This wasn't help. This wasn't a father supporting his daughter through a rough patch. This was a systematic drain. A subsidy. An allowance for 2 grown adults who had abandoned their own child. An icy rage, cold and sharp, began to creep up my spine. My hands trembled slightly as I turned the pages. Each entry was another cut. March 2nd, car repairs. August 19th, vacation money. November 27th, credit card debt. He wasn't just helping them. He was funding their entire lifestyle. He was being bled dry. Tucked between the pages of the 2018 ledger was a glossy postcard. It showed Linda and Mark, smiling, tanned, raising champagne glasses on a balcony overlooking the Amalfi Coast in Italy. On the back, in Linda's loopy handwriting, it read, "Wish you were here, Dad. Thinking of you." The postmark date was the same day his ledger noted a $5,000 wire transfer for a roof repair emergency. The cruelty of it, the sheer mocking audacity, made me feel sick. The paper trail was damning, but the digital one was even worse. I booted up his old desktop computer, the fan whirring to life in the silent room. It didn't take long to find a folder on his desktop simply labeled L&M. Inside were hundreds of emails, an archive of manipulation. Linda was a master of psychological warfare. The emails always started sweetly. "Dearest Daddy," but quickly devolved into expertly crafted guilt trips. If Mom were still alive, she would understand how hard things are for us. Or the one that made my stomach clench with nausea. "I know you always loved Sienna more, but Mark and I are your family too, and we're struggling." They had taken his greatest virtue, his boundless love for his family, and weaponized it against him. They'd used his grief for my grandmother, his sense of duty, his quiet generosity, and twisted it all into a pipeline for their own greed. He wasn't a father to them. He was a bank. My search was almost over when my hand brushed against the underside of the bottom desk drawer. I felt a piece of tape. Pulling it away, a single plain white envelope fell into my lap. My name was written on the front in his unmistakable hand. Sienna. My throat tightened, a lump forming that I couldn't swallow. I carefully opened it. Inside was a single sheet of his personalized stationery, the letter written in the same steady hand that had filled the ledgers. My dearest Sienna, it began. If you are reading this, it means I am gone, and the vultures have returned to the nest. I knew they would. Do not let your grief for me cloud your judgment, my girl. I was a fool for too long, always hoping they would change, always giving them one more chance. I see now that my love made me weak. I have given them enough chances. Now, it is time for you to stand up. Not just to protect my legacy, which is nothing more than brick and mortar, but to protect the truth. That is the only legacy that matters. You are the finest soldier I have ever known. Now, complete this mission. The letter did not tremble in my hand. Suddenly, my own hands were rock steady. The sadness that had been weighing me down for weeks solidified, transforming from a heavy, formless grief into something hard and sharp. It became a cold, clear resolve. This was no longer a lawsuit. This was not about defending myself against their greed. This was about honoring a final command. My grandfather, the judge, had passed his last sentence, and he had appointed me as his executor. The mission was clear: expose the truth, defend his honor, and ensure the vultures never picked his memory clean. The soldier's creed echoed in my mind. I will never accept defeat. I will never quit. And I would not fail. Holding my grandfather's letter, I felt the mission crystallize in my mind. The objective was clear, but the strategy was still forming. A soldier never goes into battle alone if they can help it. My personal grief had been forged into a weapon, but I needed allies. I needed a fire team. My first call wasn't to a civilian lawyer. It was to my family, my real family. I dialed the number for Major Kenji Davis of the JAG Corps. Kenji and I had been through the mud and misery of Beast Barracks together at West Point. We'd pushed each other over obstacle courses and crammed for engineering exams at 2 a.m. He was my brother in every sense of the word. He picked up on the second ring. Burke, what's wrong? He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He could hear the tension in my silence. I laid out the situation, my voice low and steady as I recounted the lawsuit, the ledgers, the letter. I expected questions, shock, maybe even pity. I got none of it. All I heard on the other end of the line was a cold, simmering fury. When I finished, there was a beat of silence. Then Kenji's voice came back, hard as steel. They picked a fight with the wrong soldier, Sienna. They have no idea who they're dealing with. He was already shifting into mission planning mode. Listen to me. You need local counsel. I know a guy in Boston, Evan Mitchell. He's a shark in the courtroom, but he's got the heart of a soldier, ex-ranger. He'll get it. I'm calling him right now. You'll hear from him within the hour. No hesitation, no questions, just immediate, unconditional support. The weight on my shoulders didn't disappear, but for the first time, I felt like I wasn't carrying it alone. This was the brotherhood I had chosen, the family forged not by blood, but by shared sacrifice. Semper Fidelis, always faithful. It was a Marine Corps motto, but the Army lived it too. Evan Mitchell's office wasn't the flashy glass and chrome affair I'd expected from a downtown Boston lawyer. It was practical, lived in. The walls were lined with bookshelves, not just law tomes, but military history. A folded American flag sat in a display case on his credenza, the kind given to the families of fallen soldiers. His own, I wondered? On the wall was a framed photo of a group of gritty, exhausted-looking men in combat gear. His Ranger platoon. Evan himself was in his early 40s, with a firm handshake and eyes that listened more than they spoke. He gestured for me to sit, then took his own seat, leaning forward with his hands clasped on his desk. He didn't take notes. He just listened. I told him everything. From being left on my grandparents' porch, to the empty chairs at West Point, to the final cruel whisper at my grandmother's funeral. Having to recount the long list of abandonments to a stranger felt like tearing open a barely healed wound. It was a humiliating, painful exposure of my life's central failure, the failure to be wanted by my own parents. When I finally finished, the room was quiet. Evan didn't offer platitudes or empty reassurances. He just held my gaze for a long moment, his expression one of profound understanding. Then he spoke, his voice calm and resolute. "Captain," he said, the title a mark of respect that felt more genuine than any I had ever received from my own family. "This isn't an inheritance dispute. This is a campaign. And it would be my honor to serve on your command staff." A wave of relief so powerful it almost made me dizzy washed over me. This man saw it. He saw me. I wasn't just a client to him. I was a fellow soldier. In that moment, I knew I had more than just a lawyer. I had an ally. The first counterattack from the enemy came sooner than I expected. Just as my grandfather's letter had predicted, the vultures were circling. My father, in a move of stunning arrogance, tried to use my career against me. My commanding officer, Colonel Miller, called me into his office the next day. He was a man of few words, a career infantry officer whose stern exterior concealed a fierce loyalty to his troops. "Close the door, Captain," he said, gesturing to the chair in front of his desk. My stomach tightened. "Sir?" "Just had a call from a Mr. Mark Carter," he said, his eyes fixed on mine, gauging my reaction. "Your father, I presume?" I nodded, my mouth suddenly dry. He expressed his deep concern. "For your mental stability," Miller continued, his voice flat, "suggested that your time overseas might have left you unwell and prone to making irrational decisions." The audacity of it was breathtaking. He was trying to get me declared unfit for duty. Colonel Miller let the accusation hang in the air for a moment longer before leaning back in his chair. I listened politely until he was finished, he said. Then a ghost of a smile touched his lips. "And then I informed Mr. Carter that Captain Burke is one of the finest officers under my command. I told him your integrity is beyond question, and that if he ever called my office again with such slander, I'd consider it harassment of a federal officer." He leaned forward again. "Is there anything you need, Captain?" I could only shake my head, overwhelmed. "No, sir. Thank you, sir." He gave a curt nod. "Good. Now get back to work." That was it. He had built a firewall around my career with a few decisive sentences. He asked for no explanation. He simply trusted his soldier. News in the military travels fast. Within days, my phone started buzzing. Texts and calls from my old unit, the guys I'd deployed with to Kandahar. Men and women who had seen me at my worst, covered in dust and exhausted beyond measure. "Heard you're in a firefight on the home front. Need backup? Got your six, Captain. Always. Go give 'em hell, ma'am." These messages, these simple declarations of loyalty from the people who had stood shoulder to shoulder with me in the most dangerous places on earth, were a lifeline. They were my family, my unit, bound together by something thicker than blood, by shared hardship, mutual respect, and unwavering loyalty. The alliance was built, the mission was underway, and I was not alone. "They failed to attack your career, Captain," Evan Mitchell told me over the phone, his voice a grim but steady presence. "They tried to flank you, and Colonel Miller shut them down. Be ready. Now they're going to get dirty. They're going to aim for you, personally." His warning proved to be prophetic. The next attack didn't come through official channels. It came from the newsstand. I was off base, trying to find a moment of normalcy in a small coffee shop. The comforting aroma of roasted beans, a welcome respite. My phone, sitting on the table beside my half-empty mug, started buzzing incessantly. A string of texts, all from my guys. My heart lurched. A constant stream of texts like that usually meant one thing. Something was wrong. The first message I opened was from my former platoon sergeant. It contained only a web link and a single, profane question. "What the hell is this, ma'am?" I clicked the link. My blood ran cold. The masthead was for the Boston Herald. The headline screamed at me in bold black letters, "War Hero or Cold-Hearted Manipulator." A grieving mother speaks out. Beneath the cruel words was a picture of Linda. It was a masterful performance. Her face was a mask of sorrow, her eyes glistening with crocodile tears. In her hands, she clutched a framed photo of me as a little girl with missing front teeth and pigtails. A photo my grandmother had taken. My hands started to shake. I forced myself to read. It was a work of fiction, a masterpiece of narcissistic propaganda. Linda had woven a tragic tale of a devoted mother whose daughter, broken by the horrors of war, had come home. Different. She painted me as a greedy, unstable veteran, suffering from severe PTSD, who was now trying to steal the family inheritance out from under her loving parents. She talked about the sleepless nights she'd had while I was deployed, the tears she'd cried. I thought back to the care packages she'd sent. A single generic greeting card once a year. I remembered my grandfather telling me she'd thrown a lavish party the week after I left for basic training, celebrating, in her words, being free of the burden. They had turned the legal battle into a public spectacle. They were no longer just fighting me in court. They were trying to execute my character in the court of public opinion. But the most vicious part, the part that felt like a physical violation, came halfway through the article. "I knew she was struggling," Mrs. Carter said, dabbing her eyes. "She sent this letter to her grandfather from Iraq." And there it was. A quote ripped from its context. From one of the most private and vulnerable letters I had ever written. During a particularly brutal tour, I had written to my grandfather, pouring out my fears, the nightmares that jolted me awake, the crushing weight of command. It was a letter meant for him alone, a moment of weakness shared with the only person I trusted completely. Linda must have found it when she was ransacking his study after his death, and she had saved it. Not as a memento, but as ammunition. She had handed my deepest fears, my most intimate pains, over to a tabloid reporter to be twisted into proof of my instability, to weaponize my trauma against me. The sense of betrayal was suffocating, a poison that seeped into every part of me. It was a wound deeper than any I'd ever received on the battlefield. I needed air. I needed sanctuary. I drove to the one place I thought I could find peace, the quiet cemetery in Portland where my grandparents were buried. But there was no peace to be found. Linda was there, waiting by the headstone, a vulture perched over a grave. She saw me and arranged her face into a sad, gentle smile. "Sienna, darling," she began, her voice a soft, syrupy coo. "We can stop all of this, right now. Just drop this foolish lawsuit and we can be a family again." I looked at the granite headstone, at the names engraved there, Charles and Margaret Carter, and then back at her. "We were never a family," I said, my voice quiet but firm. The mask dropped. Her face contorted into a snarl of pure rage. "You ungrateful little brat," she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "I gave you life. You owe me. Everything you have, you owe to me." Her rage was so absolute, so consuming, that she did something I never thought she would. She swung, her open palm cracking against my cheek. The sound was sharp, ugly in the peaceful silence of the cemetery. The sting of the slap was nothing. It was the shock of the act itself that stunned me into a cold, diamond-hard clarity. This was who she was. When the manipulation and the lies failed, this was what was left. Raw, ugly violence. I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice. I simply looked her straight in the eye. "That," I said, my voice devoid of all emotion, "is the last time you will ever lay a hand on me." I turned and walked away, leaving her standing there amidst the dead. I got back into my car and just sat, my hands gripping the steering wheel, my knuckles white. I didn't cry. The tears were gone, burned away by the white-hot fury of that final betrayal. There was nothing left to cry for. Every last, foolish hope I'd harbored for a reconciliation. Every microscopic fantasy that my mother might one day wake up and see me. It all turned to ash in that moment. It was over. The mission parameters had changed. I was no longer just defending my grandfather's legacy. I was fighting for my own survival, for my own truth. I was fighting to ensure that they would never have the power to hurt anyone like this ever again. I took a deep, steadying breath. My hand was perfectly still as I picked up my phone. I scrolled to Evan's number. "Evan," I said when he answered, my voice calm and clear. "It's Sienna. Prepare everything. We're going on the offensive. No more holding back. No mercy." Have you ever reached a point where you knew with absolute certainty that a line had been crossed and there was no going back? A moment where you had to choose to fight for yourself? If you have, please hit the like button for every single person who has had to make that stand. And in the comments, just write, "I stand with Sienna." Your support means the world. My call with Evan ended with 2 words: no mercy. That declaration wasn't born from blind rage. It was a strategic decision. The time for defense was over. It was time to build a case. I drove back to my grandfather's house in Portland, which had now transformed from a sanctuary of memory into a tactical operations center. My grief and anger were channeled into a cold, focused energy. I was no longer a grieving granddaughter. I was an intelligence officer compiling a dossier on a clear and present threat. The living room became my war room. I cleared the coffee table and rolled out a massive sheet of butcher paper, pinning it to the wall. This was my timeline. With a black Sharpie, I drew a long straight line down the center. On the left side, I began to map out my life with the precision of a mission plan. Date of birth. First day of school. Piano recitals, debate championships, high school graduation, West Point acceptance, commissioning day, deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan. Each entry was a stark, factual data point. Then, I started on the right side of the line. The life of Linda and Mark. Using my grandfather's ledgers, the emails, and a box of old postcards I found in his desk, I began to construct their pattern of life analysis. A chilling correlation began to emerge. My 4th grade piano recital, marked by their 2 empty chairs, coincided with a $2,000 withdrawal from my grandfather's account labeled L&M Anniversary Trip. While I was nervously playing Bach, they were in the Caribbean. The week I graduated as valedictorian, they were cashing a check from him to cover a minor car accident. According to a postcard, they were actually at a luxury spa in Arizona. My graduation from West Point, a seminal moment of pride for any military family, perfectly aligned with their trip to the Hamptons and a ledger entry for a $5,000 charity donation. Every milestone of my life, every moment of achievement that they had ignored, corresponded directly with an act of financial exploitation. It wasn't just neglect, it was a trade-off. My existence was secondary to their leisure. In a dusty corner of the basement, I found a heartbreaking treasure trove, a collection of old VHS tapes. My grandfather, a man who believed in documenting everything, had been our family's chronicler. I found an old VCR in a closet and hooked it up to the small television in the den. The first tape I played was labeled Sienna, HS Graduation. The picture flickered to life, grainy and washed out with age. There I was, 17 years old, standing at a podium, looking impossibly young. The camera, held by my grandfather's steady hand, captured my entire valedictorian speech. Then, as I finished to a wave of applause, the camera panned across the proud, beaming faces of the parents in the audience. And it lingered for just a moment on 2 empty chairs in the front row. Taped to the back of each chair was a small, neatly lettered sign, reserved for Linda and Mark Carter. The camera work was deliberate. It was my grandfather's silent testimony. I sent the footage to Evan. He called me an hour later, his voice uncharacteristically quiet. "I just watched it," he said. "Sienna, a jury will weep. That's not just evidence, that's a tragedy." The next phase was following the money trail. Evan's forensic accountant and I spent days digging through my grandfather's financial records. A disturbing pattern quickly became obvious. Every time my grandfather received a significant influx of cash, a year-end bonus from his old firm, a small inheritance from a sibling, his annual IRA distribution, it was followed, like clockwork, within weeks, by a panicked phone call or a desperate email from Linda about a new financial emergency. The investment opportunities for Mark were a black hole of cash. We discovered they weren't investments at all. They were payments to cover massive gambling debts in Las Vegas. While they were telling my grandfather they were at business seminars, they were losing his life savings at the blackjack tables. And there were smaller, crueler details. I found a Christmas card from Linda, dated 5 years ago. "Thinking of you and Dad so much this holiday season," she wrote. "Miss you both terribly." The postmark was from Aspen, Colorado. I cross-referenced the date with my grandfather's personal calendar. On that very day, he had an entry. Chest pains, hospital visit. While he was alone, facing a health scare, his daughter was sending him empty platitudes from a 5-star ski resort. But Evan made the most critical discovery. "Her predation wasn't limited to your grandfather," he told me, a grim tone in his voice. A deep dive into public records had revealed something startling. Linda had been involved in 2 other inheritance disputes with distant relatives years ago. Both times she had contested the wills, claiming she was owed more. Both times she had lost, but not before dragging the families through costly and painful legal battles. Evan tracked down one of the relatives, a great-aunt named Carol, who lived in a quiet retirement community in Florida. She was in her 80s, and at first she was hesitant to speak, afraid of stirring up old demons. But as Evan gently explained my situation, her fear gave way to a weary resolve. "That girl, Linda," she said, her voice thin and reedy but filled with a surprising strength. "She has a darkness in her. She always has." She agreed to testify. It's high time someone finally stood up to her. Our arsenal was now complete. We had the meticulous ledgers, a father's quiet diary of betrayal. We had the digital trail of manipulation. We had the heartbreaking visual evidence of the empty chairs. And now we had a witness to the pattern. We were no longer just defending a will. We were prosecuting a lifetime of greed and cruelty. The war room was set. The evidence was compiled. We were ready for battle. The final court date loomed, just 3 days away. Evan and I were in his Boston office, a war room of our own, with documents and evidence spread across his conference table like battlefield maps. We had the ledgers, the emails, the VHS tape, and the testimony of Great-Aunt Carol. Our defenses were solid. "We have more than enough to defend the will, Captain," Evan said, leaning back in his chair with a look of cautious optimism. "Their case is built on lies, and we can prove it." I looked at the meticulous stacks of evidence. He was right. We had a formidable shield. But something in my gut, a battlefield instinct honed by years of anticipating enemy movements, told me it wasn't enough. "Defense is not enough, Evan," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "Defense means we let them set the terms of engagement. We need a counter-offensive. We need to end this." Evan raised an eyebrow. "What do you have in mind?" A thought, a nagging inconsistency, had been bothering me. My grandfather was a judge. He was meticulous, especially with his finances. The idea that he would leave any ambiguity in his final days just doesn't sit right with me. I looked Evan straight in the eye. "Get a subpoena for his bank records. I want to see every transaction, every inquiry for the last week of his life. I want to know if they tried something." Evan was skeptical. I could see it in his eyes. It felt like a long shot, but he trusted my instincts. "I'll make the call," he said, reaching for the phone. He called David Prescott, the longtime manager of the Portland Bank branch where my grandfather had been a client for over 30 years. I listened to Evan's side of the conversation. It was professional, courteous, but firm. He explained the situation, mentioned the subpoena he was filing, and requested cooperation. There was a long pause. I could hear the faint, muffled sound of David's voice on the other end. Then Evan's expression changed. His professional demeanor sharpened into something more intense. He straightened up, his eyes widening slightly. "Mr. Prescott," Evan said, his voice now laced with urgency. "Could you meet with us, in my office, as soon as possible?" Another pause. "Thank you," Evan said, hanging up the phone. He looked at me, a strange mix of shock and excitement on his face. "He's on his way," He said, "Thank God you called. Something happened that week that's been keeping me up at night." My heart hammered against my ribs. We had found something. We had found the weak point in the enemy's line. 2 hours later, David Prescott, a kind-faced man in his late 50s with worry etched around his eyes, sat across from us at the conference table. He wrung his hands nervously. "Judge Carter, Charles, was more than a client," David began, his voice soft. "He was a pillar of our community. I've managed his account since I was a junior teller. I knew his signature better than I know my own." He took a deep breath. 4 days before he passed away, his daughter, Linda Carter, came into the bank. Evan and I exchanged a look. This was it. She seemed very agitated. David continued. She presented me with a power of attorney document, giving her full legal authority over all of his accounts. She said her father was too weak to handle his affairs, and that he had instructed her to liquidate his primary savings account and transfer the entire balance to her name. The audacity was stunning. While he lay dying, she wasn't by his side. She was at his bank, trying to empty it. "What did you do?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. David looked directly at me, his expression firming with professional pride. "Well, first, I looked at the document. The signature was close, but it was a forgery. Charles had a slight tremor in his later years, but his signature was always strong, decisive. This one was hesitant. It was faked." He shook his head. "And second, I had spoken to the judge myself just 2 days prior. He was frail, yes, but his mind was as sharp as a tack. The idea that he would sign over everything without speaking to me first was unthinkable." He leaned forward. I politely but firmly refused the transaction. I told her the signature didn't appear to be valid and that for a transaction of this size, I would need to get direct verbal confirmation from Judge Carter himself. My breath caught in my throat. I could picture the scene perfectly. "Did she get angry?" I asked. David let out a short, bitter laugh. "Oh, you have no idea. The performance was quite something. The tears, the accusations. She threatened to sue me, to sue the bank, to have my job. She called me a heartless bureaucrat who was preventing a dying man from getting the care he needed." He paused, a flicker of satisfaction in his eyes. So I called her bluff. I picked up my desk phone and said, "Ma'am, I would be more than happy to call Judge Carter right now to confirm his wishes. I have his hospital room number right here." She snatched the fraudulent document off my desk and was out the door in less than 10 seconds. Evan stared at him, then at me, a slow grin spreading across his face. He looked like a predator who had just caught the scent of blood. The ledgers, the emails, the empty chairs, they were all about the past. They were about character. They were a shield. This was different. This was a crime. Attempted bank fraud. Forgery. Elder financial abuse. This wasn't just a story of a greedy daughter anymore. This was a legal smoking gun. Evan stood up and began to pace the room, a new ferocious energy radiating from him. "They have no idea we know this," he said almost to himself. "They're going to walk into that courtroom thinking this is a simple inheritance dispute." He stopped and looked at me, his eyes blazing. "Captain, we don't just have a shield anymore." He tapped the sworn affidavit David Prescott had just agreed to sign. "Now we have a spear." The final day of the trial felt like the moment before a breach. The air was electric, thick with unspoken tension. Miles Archer, my parents' lawyer, approached the plaintiff's table with the swagger of a man who believed he was about to land the killing blow. He was going all in. His strategy was a full frontal assault on my grandfather's character and my own. One by one, he called 3 of my grandfather's former colleagues to the stand. Old, respectable men who testified that in his final years, Charles had become forgetful, a bit eccentric, and prone to bouts of confusion. They were painting a picture of a senile old man, easily manipulated. Then Archer turned his guns on me. He twisted my military service, suggesting my deployments had left me emotionally scarred and desperate for money. He presented the tabloid article from the Boston Herald as evidence of my unstable character. The courtroom grew tense. I watched the jury. Their faces were grim, uncertain. Beside Archer, Linda dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, a perfect portrait of a victim. Mark sat beside her, his expression a mask of smug satisfaction. They truly believed they had won. Then, it was Evan's turn. "The defense calls Mr. David Prescott to the stand," he announced, his voice calm and clear. A ripple of confusion went through the plaintiff's side. David was not on any of their witness lists. As our bank manager walked steadily to the witness stand, I saw a flicker of panic in my mother's eyes. She knew that name. Evan began simply. "Mr. Prescott, how long were you Judge Charles Carter's personal banker?" "Over 30 years," David replied. "So you were familiar with his habits, his signature?" "Extremely familiar, yes." Then Evan lowered the boom. "Mr. Prescott, can you please tell the court about the visit you received from Mrs. Linda Carter 4 days before Judge Carter passed away?" As David recounted the story, the forged power of attorney, the demand to liquidate the account, his refusal, a wave of murmurs swept through the courtroom. Every eye turned to my mother. Her face, moments before a picture of grieving motherhood, was now a ghastly shade of white. "Objection!" Archer shouted, leaping to his feet. "Relevance! This has no bearing on the validity of the will." "Overruled," Judge Reynolds said, his voice like flint. "This has every bearing on the plaintiff's motives and character. Please continue, Mr. Prescott." But the damage was done. The first crack had appeared in their wall of lies. "The defense calls Captain Sienna Burke to the stand," Evan said. I walked to the stand, my back straight, my steps measured. I could feel my parents' venomous glares, but I did not look at them. I looked at the jury. I looked at the judge. Under Evan's calm questioning, I laid out the facts. I didn't speak with emotion. I spoke with the clarity and precision of an after-action report. The timeline of their absence, which we projected onto a large screen, was damning. The ledgers, the emails, the vacation postcards, each piece of evidence was a hammer blow against their credibility. I recounted the story of the empty chairs, my voice never wavering. When I finished, Evan paused, letting the weight of the evidence settle in the silent room. Then he asked his final question. "Captain Burke, why are you pursuing this case with such determination?" I finally allowed myself to look at my parents. Then I turned my gaze to the 12 men and women on the jury. "Because my grandfather taught me that honor is the only thing we truly own in this world," I said, my voice clear and steady. "And he taught me to defend it at all costs." I returned to my seat. The air was thick. The jury was looking at my parents with open contempt. "The defense rests, Your Honor," Evan said. Archer, visibly shaken, declined to cross-examine. He had nothing left. "Very well," said Judge Reynolds. "Does the defense have anything further?" Evan stood. "No further witnesses, Your Honor," he said. "But we do have one final piece of evidence, a video deposition." The courtroom lights dimmed. A large screen descended from the ceiling, and then he was there. My grandfather. The video had been recorded 2 months before his death, arranged by his own lawyer. He was sitting in his favorite leather armchair in his study, looking frail but utterly lucid. His eyes, though weary, were as sharp and intelligent as ever. He looked directly into the camera, as if he were looking into the future, into this very room. "I, Charles Carter," he began, his voice weak but firm, "being of sound mind and a rather stubborn body, do hereby declare that my last will and testament, dated October 14th, is an accurate and complete reflection of my final wishes." He paused, taking a slow breath. He seemed to be looking right through the screen, past the judge, past the jury, his eyes landing on my mother. "Linda," he said, and her name in his voice was both a caress and a judgment. "If you are watching this, know that I have always loved you. I will always love you. But love is not a blank check. It is not an entitlement." His gaze softened for a moment, then hardened with resolve. "Sienna chose to stay. You chose to leave. My will is not a punishment. It is simply an acknowledgement of the choices you both made." He looked back into the camera, his eyes finding mine across time. "The matter is settled." The screen went black. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. It was the silence of a truth so profound it left no room for argument. Miles Archer stood frozen, his mouth slightly agape. Mark stared at the blank screen, his face slack with disbelief. And my mother, Linda, finally broke. She buried her face in her hands, but the sobs that racked her body were not of grief. They were the guttural sounds of absolute defeat. The game was over. My grandfather had just checkmate from beyond the grave. The silence that followed my grandfather's final words on screen was deafening. It was the sound of a war ending. Judge Reynolds, his face a mask of judicial stone, didn't need to deliberate. He didn't even consult the jury, though I could see in their eyes that their verdict was unanimous. He brought his gavel down, the sharp crack echoing the finality of the moment. This court finds in favor of the defendant, Captain Sienna Burke, he declared, his voice ringing with disdain for the plaintiffs. The last will and testament of Judge Charles Carter is hereby declared valid in its entirety. He wasn't finished. He fixed my parents with a glacial stare. Furthermore, he continued, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl, this court finds that this lawsuit was frivolous, malicious, and brought forth in an act of profound greed and disrespect. Therefore, the plaintiffs, Linda and Mark Carter, are ordered to pay for all of the defendants' legal fees and associated court costs. It was a total, unequivocal victory, the final nail in the coffin of their lies. I watched as my mother crumpled, her carefully constructed facade shattering into a million pieces. She let out a series of racking sobs, but they were the ugly, gasping sounds of a gambler who had just lost everything. There was no remorse in them, only the raw agony of defeat. My father said nothing. He simply stood up, straightened his tie, and without a single glance in my direction or my mother's, walked out of the courtroom. He just left. A coward to the very end. Evan gave my shoulder a firm, proud squeeze. We had done it. We had won. But the final battle was not fought in the courtroom. It was fought on the courthouse steps. As I walked out into the bright, unforgiving sunlight, a swarm of local news reporters descended, microphones and cameras thrust in my face. And through the chaos, she came at me. Linda. Her face was blotchy, streaked with mascara, a grotesque parody of a grieving mother. She grabbed my arm, her grip surprisingly strong. Sienna, you can't do this to me, she wailed, her voice pitched for maximum public sympathy. I'm your mother, a mother. You can't just throw your mother away. For a moment, the world seemed to slow down. The flashing cameras, the shouted questions from reporters, it all faded into a dull roar. All I could see was her face, the face of the woman who gave me life. And all I could feel was a profound, bottomless sadness. The anger was gone, burned out, leaving only an empty ache. I looked down at her hand on my arm, the perfectly manicured nails digging into my sleeve, and slowly, gently, I uncurled her fingers and removed her hand. I met her desperate, tear-filled eyes, and for the first time, I didn't see a monster. I just saw a broken, hollow person. Margaret Carter was my mother, I said, my voice so quiet I wasn't sure if the reporters could even hear it, but I knew she could. She was the one at the piano recitals. She was the one who held me when I cried. She was the one who chose me. I looked at her one last time, at the biological fact of her existence. You, I said, and the words were not born of hatred, but of a sad, final acceptance, are merely a biological fact. That was the final cut. The severing of a cord that should have been cut decades ago. I saw the flicker of understanding in her eyes, the realization that her power over me, the power of guilt and obligation, was gone forever. I turned and walked away, Evan clearing a path for me through the media circus. Back in the quiet of my hotel room, the adrenaline faded, and a crushing exhaustion took its place. I stood at the window, looking down at the bustling streets of Boston. I should have felt triumphant. I should have been celebrating. Instead, I just felt empty. The victory tasted like ashes. Yes, I had defended my grandfather's honor. I had exposed their lies and won the battle. But the cost was immense. I had lost my parents all over again, and this time, it was for good. There was no going back. The war was over, but the wounds remained, aching in the silence. The battle was won, but I felt no peace. The next morning, I checked out of the hotel. I didn't book a flight back to my base. I got in my car and started driving north, towards Maine, towards home. There was no celebratory steak dinner, no champagne toast. My victory lap was a quiet drive up I-95. When I arrived in Portland, I didn't go to the house. I went to the florist and bought 2 large bouquets of red anthuriums, my grandmother's favorite. Then, I went to the cemetery. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns. A gentle breeze rustled through the tall oak trees. It was peaceful here. I knelt on the soft grass between their graves, the cool stone of their shared headstone a comfort against my hand. I placed one bouquet on Margaret's side, the other on Charles's. I stayed there for a long time, not saying anything, just breathing. I let the silence, the wind, and the quiet dignity of the place wash over me, cleansing the filth of the past few months. Mission complete, I whispered finally, my voice thick. I did it. And as the wind sighed through the leaves above, for the first time since this whole nightmare began, I felt a flicker of peace. The battle was over. The aftershocks were settling. I was home. The peace I found in that cemetery was not an ending. It was a beginning. It was the quiet, solid ground upon which I could finally build a future. The inheritance my grandfather left me was substantial, but I knew its true value wasn't in the numbers on a bank statement. Its value was in the opportunity it provided, the opportunity to create a legacy worthy of the man he was. A year after the trial, I stood on a small stage in a community hall in Portland. Before me was the inaugural class of scholarship recipients for the newly established Burke Legacy Foundation. The inheritance was not spent on a new car or a fancy house. It was invested in them, a bright, resilient group of kids from all over the country, all children of military members being raised by their grandparents. I looked out at their young, hopeful faces, and I saw myself. I saw the same mix of pride and quiet hurt, the same fierce love for the grandparents who had stepped in when others had stepped away. I want to tell you something my grandfather taught me, I said, my voice clear and strong. Family is not about the house you were born into. It's about the people who show up. It's about the home you build in each other's hearts. I smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile. Family isn't where you come from. It's where you belong. Your mission is to find the people who choose you every single day. And when you find them, you never, ever let them go. The courtroom battle had done more than just settle a legal dispute. It had ignited a new fire within me. Watching Evan Mitchell fight for me, seeing how the law could be a weapon for truth, I felt the pull of a new calling. Inspired by my grandfather, I applied for and was accepted into the Army's funded legal education program. I traded my Signal Corps insignia for the scales of justice of the JAG Corps. The years passed. The captain's bars on my shoulders were replaced by the gold oak leaf of a major, then the silver of a lieutenant colonel, and finally, the proud eagle of a full colonel. Captain Sienna Burke, the soldier, had become Judge Sienna Burke, the arbiter of military justice. I presided over court-martials with the sharp, analytical mind of a lawyer, but also with the deep, unwavering empathy of a commander who understood the weight of a soldier's burden. And tucked into a hidden pocket of my judicial robes, I always carried a small, worn photograph of Charles and Margaret, its edges softened by years of touch. They were no longer a reminder of my loss. They were my compass, my true north. One day, a letter arrived at my office. The envelope was addressed in a shaky, unfamiliar script, but I recognized the return address. It was from a nursing home in Florida. It was from Linda. I opened it, my heart calm and steady. The letter was a rambling, self-pitying litany of regrets. She was old now, she wrote, and sick, and utterly alone. Mark had left her years ago for a younger woman and a new set of credit cards to max out. Her letter was filled with apologies that sounded more like accusations, and it ended with a desperate plea for a reconciliation, for her daughter to be by her side in her final days. I read the letter twice, then folded it neatly. There was no anger, no bitterness, no desire for revenge. There was only a quiet sense of finality. I took out a sheet of my personal stationery and wrote a brief, polite reply. I did not dredge up the past. I did not list her sins. I simply and kindly declined her request, ending the letter with 4 simple words. I wish you peace. I sealed the envelope and sent it off. I had forgiven her, not for her sake, but for mine. Forgiveness wasn't about letting her back into my life. It was about finally letting her go from mine. I had closed that chapter, and I had done so with the one thing she had never shown me: grace. The story doesn't end there. It continues, every day. It continues in the courtroom where I now preside. Just last week, I was overseeing a complicated case. A young captain, a logistics officer, was on the stand, her voice shaking but her resolve firm as she fought for the truth against a powerful superior who had tried to silence her. I looked down at her from the bench, at her courage, at her unwavering integrity. And I saw the legacy, living and breathing. When the proceedings were over for the day, I called her to the bench. "Captain," I said, my voice both the stern judge and the seasoned mentor, "you did well today." She looked up, surprised. "Thank you, Colonel." I smiled, a small, knowing smile. "Just remember," I said, my voice softening, "justice isn't always about winning the easy battles. Sometimes it's about standing your ground for the truth, no matter the cost. Hold that line." She stood a little taller, a new understanding in her eyes. "Yes, ma'am," she said. As she walked away, I felt a profound sense of peace. The legacy of Judge Charles Carter wasn't in a will, or a house, or a bank account. It was in that young captain's spine of steel. It lived on in the scholarships that gave kids like me a fighting chance. It lived on in me. A legacy not of blood, but of honor. Passed down from one soldier to the next, a self-made dawn after a long, dark night. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. Thank you for listening to my journey. It began as a battle over an inheritance, but it became a fight for my own soul. It taught me that our deepest wounds can become our greatest strengths, and that our true legacy isn't what's left to us, but what we choose to leave behind for others. There are countless stories of honor and resilience out there, waiting to be told. If you believe in the power of stories like mine to inspire and heal, I invite you to follow this channel. And perhaps share this story with one person you know who is fighting their own battle. Let them know they are not alone. Thank you.